Kickoff for the 2024 SEC football season is just around the corner, and helping us break it down, good friend of the show, Chris Lee of Southeastern 16 now, not Southeastern 14, Chris. I even caught myself there for just a moment. Southeastern 16, Chris Lee joins the show. Chris, what's going on, man? Appreciate you taking
Well, you know, we were 14 for 3.5 years, so I've caught myself doing that once or twice, less than I would have thought, but it's a fun change.
For sure, Chris. So as we look at the 2024 season again, you guys, just like us, and y'all do great work over at Southeastern 16, man. You're somebody I've looked up to for a while and appreciate you, our friendship, our relationship, and again, the great work you guys have done. But you guys, similar to us, have been breaking this thing down, looking forward to kickoff for months now. Is there a storyline or off-season narrative that has become exhausting to you? We all have those where it's just like, you hear it over and over and over again, and maybe it's one of those things that it sparks up at media days or maybe before that where it's like it's this talking point that everybody keeps going back to, and maybe you don't think it's as big of a deal or it's just it's on repeat. Is there anything like that for you where it's just like, man, I'm so ready for kickoff so we can stop talking about this?
I mean, my mind went in a bunch of places because everything in the SEC is overbaked, right? Like you and I are in this content business. We know, like you think that you've hit a limit where people can get enough, and no, you have not. You seem to never hit that limit in the SEC. But, you know, I think going back a little bit, the Florida Billy Napier thing to me is kind of interesting. I look at their schedule, and I've started a model where I just look at how many points above average or below average is a team. Like if you want to match up, just pick two teams out of a hat. I can take the number for one team, take a number for, and I looked at Florida's schedule. Florida's got, I mean, the degree which Florida's schedule is tougher than everybody else's in this league is ridiculous. It's like the equivalent of playing Miami every week, who coincidentally Florida gets in the opener. And think about that, because like you just get two dog games in there against an Akron or Toledo or somebody. And where am I going with this? My point is, it feels like maybe Billy Napier kind of got buried, and I get that they've underachieved and everything, but I think that if they win 7 games of that schedule, that'll be a good year. They've started to, they've got a backup quarterback behind Graham Mertz, who everybody wanted, and DJ Lagway. Felt like they hit it a little bit in the portal. I think that's one that just got played on loop for a while. And look, it may not work out for him, but I looked at their team a little bit and I said, hey, that it might be a little better than people are thinking. So I don't, maybe everybody's burying Billy Napier, and it could happen anyway. It is one thing. The Alabama thing's just a curiosity to me because I don't know what to think of them. Of course, Alabama, it never stops in Tuscaloosa, but on one hand, I don't think they got the dudes that Nick Saban's prime Alabama team. There's just not the star power there. On the other hand, they've always recruited well. The coach they just brought in has got a higher winning percentage as head coach than the one that just left, believe it or not. I don't have a good and ready answer, but those are two things that kind of at the top of my head. And I think everybody's always looking for the next sleeper team. I wonder if maybe Kentucky's getting enough publicity, although the schedule might be a little prohibited. I don't think I directly answered your question, but those are just some things at the top of my mind when we start talking about kind of topics of interest, I guess.
Chris, I want to go back to what you said about Billy Napier, because I would agree with you. The closer we've gotten to kickoff, the more I believe that, barring some complete collapse, I think he's going to be back in Gainesville. Talking to folks that cover the Gators, I think the hot seat chatter around Billy from the masses is a little bit overplayed, but sticking with the narrative or the theme of hot seat, Sam Pittman at Arkansas, Shane Beamer's seat maybe starting to warm a little, Clark Lee at Vanderbilt, some people have talked about. What do you make of the coaches who are starting to feel pressure, some more than others, going into the 2024 season?
I don't know how Sam Pittman survives it. I'm looking at their schedule. They are probably going to be underdogs 8 times, and I don't think their roster is bad. You've seen them top 50 in most computers. I mean, you've seen Arkansas worse than that, but once the drumbeat starts, that a coach needs to be gone. It's been going for a while. That's hard to run past. Vanderbilt's kind of interesting because I don't think Clark Lee's done a great job there, but that job somehow, like, and I thought when he took that job, like, okay, this is like anytime you take the Vandy job, right, Chris, it's hard. I thought when he took that job after the Sarah Fuller fiasco wrecked that team at the end of the year and all that, like, you're taking that at an all-time low. And I feel like then what happened? They still haven't finished the stadium. They'll have one end zone finish this year. So it's on year 4 with this stadium that was allegedly in the works before he started, and then the transfer portal in NIL. The NIL they were way behind on. Their athletic department was way more focused on gender equity and stuff like that for NIL, which leaves your football coach further behind. And so somehow I think Vandy's in a situation to where you wouldn't think that job could have gotten less attractive than when he took it in 2020, but somehow it did with all the forces around it. So that's an interesting one. If you fire him, then it's like, well, what does that tell the world? You got rid of a coach before you even built his stadium for him. He's an alum. You did very little to help him. But at the same time, let's say they go 0-8 in the SEC, which I think is entirely likely. He's won 2 SEC games in 4 years. You can't sell that either. That's going to be an interesting one. Who was the other one you mentioned, Chris? I'm sorry.
Shane Beamer. Just mentioned the seat is warming. I don't think he's on the hot seat by any means, and I think he's back next year, but seat's starting to warm ever so slightly.
Yeah, that's an interesting one too, because and it's kind of like Vandy, although it's different. Like the glory years are still within memory, right? But nobody's really done what Steve Spurrier was doing there, 10, 12 years ago since. And I think, man, he's a tough one, Chris, because I get that last year didn't hit the mark, but I also remember his first year, and you looked at that roster, and it was almost Vanderbilt-like in talent. They got to a bowl game. I remember looking at their quarterback room before he got there and just going, it looks like a bunch of guys that are like me and you, and he got that team to a bowl game. And then he got a lot of mileage out of that end of the season, Clemson and Tennessee 2 years ago. Did he get too much mileage out of that? I don't know. I'm more bullish on Shane Beamer than most people. I like the culture that he's tried to bring there. I'm a big fan of a lot of stuff he does. The results have been kind of maybe not what they wanted, but again, if you take that little slice of things out that Spurrier did for a few years, Carolina is not historically a program in the top half of the SEC. So I get why they're frustrated, but I'm not as convinced if this year doesn't go well that they need to make a change there.
Chris, I want to switch gears and talk the Ole Miss Rebels and Lane Kiffin. Obviously, it's very well documented, what they did in the transfer portal, the pieces they've added. And everyone seems to have them penciled into their 12-team college football playoff. Chris, let's play the hypothetical game, which is typically what we do this time of year. If Ole Miss does not make the playoff, if they win less than 10 games, let's say they go 8-4, in your mind, looking at that roster, like what went wrong for Ole Miss if that were to happen?
I'm thinking maybe the chemistry didn't go well. That would be number one. That Lane Kiffin has built this thing on the portal, right? But sometimes you see locker rooms, especially kids that have been multiple schools. And I'm looking at Juice Wells as one of those guys. And especially we got a lot of mouths to feed. And they've got a really first-class receiver room with Jordan Watkins and Trey Harris there. I could see that being a reason. I'm not thinking of any kid in particular, but you just know the human nature and the way those go. I think number two, and their schedule is a lot of reason that people are pegging them to get there. And I think that's valid, although I think maybe their raw talent might be better than people even perceive. People are going like, well, Ole Miss has got a path to the playoff because of the schedule. I'm like, hey, this team might be good enough, even with a tougher schedule, to get there. But it's a battle of individual games, Chris. I'll give you a team in your state, Clemson last year. Clemson lost 2 games in overtime. You win those games, you're, 11-2 at the end of everything instead of 9-4. That looks a lot different. They've got some games, although the first part of the schedule, they're going to be double-digit favorites, probably their first 6 games or close to it. And then comes the real stuff. At LSU, Oklahoma, followed by Georgia, at Florida. I don't think that's a give me. And, of course, Mississippi State. But here's the thing, Chris. You only get so many losses when your schedule's not easy. Let's say you go down and you lose a game by a field goal at LSU, a field goal at Oklahoma on the last play. Then you got 2 losses. The Georgia game, which I don't think they're going to win. That's 3 losses. They're not going to the playoffs. They might be a playoff caliber team. They might have a relatively easy schedule, but is a game of individual contests. And they've got some really close ones. If they stub their toe there, I don't think there's going to be a lot of grace for them. And so those are the 2 ways in my mind that it could go wrong for them.
Chris, obviously the overriding, top storyline coming in the 2024 season is that of Texas and Oklahoma joining the league. Again, it's why you guys have gone to Southeastern 16. They are the 2 new members, pushing it to 16. What do you make of the Longhorns and the Sooners in year 1? Again, 2 programs that are in 2 different spots, right? We're talking about Texas being in the college football playoff, Oklahoma, we're talking about can they get to 8 wins, but still 2 very, very proud programs, history rich, tons of tradition. What do you see for them? And do you see, there's been a lot of chatter about the SEC grind week in, week out, and they're going to get humbled. And then you got, people are kind of split, right? You have that group, and then you have this other group that think, hey, Texas and Oklahoma, they've been playing big-time football for a long time. They will not be intimidated, take a step back or take a seat behind anyone. Where do you typically fall when it comes to that conversation?
That's a great question. In fact, going back to the question you led the show off with, if you're talking about maybe overbaked storylines, I'm getting, it's kind of like Texas and Oklahoma, and I'm not sure that's fair. And I get how Texas, and that's not a shot at Texas, right? I get, but Texas is the headliner, and the more that I look at Oklahoma's roster, I'm like, hey, I can make the case where Oklahoma's got a top 3 or 4 roster in the league, depending on how Jackson Arnold does, if he's what they think he is. If he's a guy that threw a few picks in the bowl game last year, that's a different conversation. But I don't know. You can go back to when Missouri joined the league. And I get it was a different time that the East was down, but what happened? Missouri joined the league. This is going to break them. They win the division the first 2 years. Let's also stick with Missouri in baseball as a different example. Missouri in baseball about 15 years ago had it going. I mean, they were putting Max Scherzer and Aaron Crow in the league, and they were going to the tournament pretty regularly. Well, what's happened in baseball is the league broke Missouri. They've not been to an NCAA tournament since they've been in the SEC. My point here is you've seen it go both ways. Now, Missouri baseball is probably a bad analogy because it is not Oklahoma and Texas football. But neither was Missouri, and the league didn't come in and crush them right away. And, oh, by the way, guess who else is in playoff contention this year? Missouri. I think, to me, I do think there's going to be a year where they have an elite team and the week in, week out grind gets them, like the year South Carolina beat Alabama, right? Sometimes you just run in those years, you lose a couple of close games. Happened to Georgia last year in the title game. Georgia was probably a top 4 team in the country. That may be a little bit of a non-answer, but it feels to me like the strong teams generally survive and get stronger with stronger competition, which is what I suspect is going to happen. I would be more skeptical about Texas because Texas's history, I don't think the last 30 years has matched what the fans think that program is, but they've got the right coach at the right time who just went into Tuscaloosa. So I think the timing there is really good for them. But I think Oklahoma's been the one that's been a little undervalued in this because Oklahoma, it's been a long time. I mean, you have to go back to Blake when they were not any good for consecutive years. And the Big 12, I know this is SEC country, but that's a league and in the Big 12, the thing I always liked about them, Chris, you played everybody.
Mm-hmm.
So that might mean you play Kansas and Iowa State, but that also meant you didn't ever escape Oklahoma or Kansas State or whoever, and they were never really down. Hadn't been in a long time. I think Oklahoma in particular feels like, based on its history, is really ripe to survive this.
Chris, you mentioned the Georgia Bulldogs. I want to go there. It feels like, even with as good as Texas is and as good as Ole Miss can be, and you mentioned Missouri and LSU and Tennessee, Alabama, of course, it feels like Georgia is that clear-cut number one team in the SEC right now. Is that fair to say? Would you agree with that? Or do you feel like, maybe Texas is on par or somebody else is on par with Georgia? Or is it the Dogs and then everybody else is chasing them?
I look at them sometimes and I go, okay, I'm thinking of the biggest dudes the biggest, baddest dudes that Kirby Smart has had since he's been in Athens. And there's not a Brock Bowers, there's not a Jordan Davis. But then you look down, and I started keeping count of how many guys made an All-American list. And that might be Phil Steele's fourth team. Chris, they had 5 guys on offense and 5 guys on defense that made somebody's All-American team. And I'm not counting kickers and punters, not that they had one, but I'm just saying. And that includes their quarterback, who's the preseason Heisman favorite, and that includes 4/5 of their offensive line. And by the way, the guy they got in between that, Jared Wilson's played some for them too. So, if the people that do this for a living and put those things together are right, yeah, I don't know how you can't say that is clearly the top team in the country.
Chris, I know you mentioned Kalen DeBoer in Alabama, and things are as different in Tuscaloosa as they've ever been. We got music being played at practice. People are watching practice from their balcony at their apartments, like unprecedented times. I know nobody can sit here and say they know for certain what's going to happen because you're replacing the GOAT. But when you look at Alabama this year specifically, do you think the Crimson Tide drop off in a major way, or do you expect them to be right back there in the playoff?
Chris, that is the biggest mystery I got going into this, because again, you go back to vintage Alabama. You look when they had Derrick Henry and Ingram in the same running back room, and they had a third guy too that made it. I've forgotten the name. That you had, just one quarterback after another in the NFL. You had that legendary receiving room with Devontae Smith and Jerry Jeudy and those guys. And then you had just linebackers and linemen coming out of your ears. Every year they put a first round offensive tackle in there and 2 defensive linemen in the first round and a top 10 corner. I don't think this roster has that kind of star power. And I watched them last year, and it just didn't look like the same Alabama. But yet, at the end of it all, Chris, they beat Georgia right in the midst of prime unbeatable Georgia. They took that loss early. They got back from it. And so I don't see the same kind of dudes they had, but they're also the same team that knocked off Georgia. And, maybe if not for a bad snap, they go further in the playoff. And then I love the hire. I mean, you're not going to keep Nick Saban forever, but I feel like DeBoer is as good as just about anybody could have gotten. He's won everywhere he's been. He's played an exciting brand of football. Washington, come on. We're sitting here in the middle of crazy SEC country. I was in Seattle a month ago. Let me tell you, you're not walking around in Seattle, just everywhere you look, somebody wearing a different college football hat or shirt. It's a pro town. I don't know what the recruiting base in Washington is like. I know you can get a lot of guys from Northern California, and teams have cleaned up on that. So I'm just going, you've got a guy that just took Washington to the playoff, built the best offensive line in the country, won everywhere he's been. Yeah, you've got mixed information all over the place, and I don't know where that settles.
So as we look at the rest of the SEC, Chris, kind of the next bunch of teams, LSU, Tennessee, Missouri, what do you make of that group? And I think that I guess you could maybe throw Ole Miss in there, and I think that sparks a debate, obviously, of how many SEC teams do we see
Yeah.
get in the college football playoff? Is it 4? Is it 5? Because at one time, Chris, I was of the belief that, hey, if you're a 10-2 or better SEC team, you're in the playoff. But I think there's a scenario where if we have, God forbid, maybe it's this year, 5 or 6 SEC teams at 10 or more wins, schedule's going to start to matter. Like you mentioned Ole Miss. I think if they go 10-2 and lose the wrong games and the league is top heavy in that way, I think Ole Miss could get left out. I think it's a very real possibility if they lose the wrong games and don't have that key signature win. But either way, again, the rest of those teams, LSU, Tennessee, Mizzou, like I mentioned, what do you make of that group, and who do you like the most? It seems to me LSU, Mizzou, Tennessee are kind of those 3 teams that are sort of bunched up anywhere between 10 to 15 in most of the preseason polls.
Well, I mentioned earlier, I've got a model that I use just to do hypothetical matchups of teams. It's points above average. You can throw in 2.5 points for the home field, wherever somebody's game is. But you've got a pack of teams. And after team number 16, which happens to be Clemson, the drop off to everybody else is about 3.5 points, or 3 points actually to Kansas State. But you've got 8 SEC teams in that pack. You got Georgia in order, Texas, Alabama, LSU, Ole Miss, Oklahoma, Missouri, Tennessee. No, that is just based on FPI and those guys putting stuff into a computer and trusting it. But it's a good head start, right? And I look at some of these and I go, I think in particular I can make a case that Ole Miss might be better than the number that's in here, but still firmly in that group of 16. Of course, that's half the country. That's half of these 16 teams. And this is where I think it's going to get interesting. When we watch Selection Sunday or whatever we're calling it, does it start to become like basketball, where teams are really getting dinged for strength of schedule, or is it just we're going to pick the 12 teams that we think are the best? And you've seen analytics come into that. And the committee's actually gone to where in basketball that they're saying, hey, these guys didn't have enough wins, but, Ken Palm loves them, top 25 team. And people pay attention to that stuff because we develop these models that people intuitively trust. I think that's the other question, is just like, what does it look like when we hear the justifications of who got in and who got left out? And does that start to sound a lot like what we hear in basketball?
Chris, before I get you out of here, I know you mentioned probably it's one of those things we talk about too much, but I want to get your take on sort of the middle of the pack, lower third of the SEC, really. Is there anyone in the SEC that you look at that maybe is not being talked about enough, like you mentioned, that you are higher on than most you find and think could have a big season this year and surprise? Again, it feels like there's a lot of parity in the SEC, but it's at the top, Chris. That's kind of what it feels. It's all at the top. It's all bunched up at the top. But is there anybody else that maybe you feel like you're seeing something most others aren't, that you think that team could have a surprise season?
My friend Mike Bratton asked me last year on his show, who's your surprise team? And I said, I think it's Missouri. Because when I looked at that roster, I said, I think that maybe the name on the helmet is not getting the attention that the talent deserved. I don't know if I was lucky or good on that one, but it worked out okay.
Good call.
All that to say, I don't know that I have one that jumps out like that this year. And part of it is schedule, right? Because you can be plenty improved, but you run into a gauntlet of Oklahoma, Texas, Tennessee, Alabama, 4 in a row or something like that. And, God have mercy on your soul unless you're Georgia. But I think the team to me that I think is a little bit better. Again, I just went through this thing. I put this computer model together, seeing what it says. Kentucky is a full touchdown below that lower end of the pack. And I look at that roster and I say, okay, we don't know what Brock Vandagriff's going to be, but he was a 5-star kid at Georgia. that's a program that knows how to spot talent. I look at that receiving room. I've always loved Barry and Brown and Dane Key. They got Jamori Macklin from North Texas, who was a 1,000-yard guy a year ago. They've got a bunch of guys who played a bunch of snaps in the trenches, including returnees at left tackle and center, who are all conference candidates, in Marcus and Eli Cox. That's a big thing you like to have. You look on defense, they got Deion Walker in the middle, potential first-round pick. J.J. Weaver, who's been there forever, coming off the edge, he's put up numbers. Jamon Dumas-Johnson from Georgia, all-conference guy. Derek Jackson, who's been there forever, played a ton of ball. They got Max Hairston, cornerback, potential first-team all-league guy. I'm just looking at that, I'm going, that's a lot of guys. That's a lot of star power for a team that, isn't anywhere near the playoff pack. Now, I think what happens, they got a schedule at Georgia, at Ole Miss. I don't think at Florida's easy, at Tennessee, at Texas. That's too many ats. I've got somebody in there as a road game that's not a home, but more or less either way, that's a lot of tough trips. And I don't know that Kentucky can bite off winning it at Tennessee or an Ole Miss or somebody like that, and that's where the whole thing might self-destruct. But I look at the talent and go, hey, you give these guys Missouri's schedule, we may be talking about a team that makes a playoff.
Chris Lee of Southeastern 16, one of the best in the business when it comes to talking all things SEC football. Chris, let folks know where they can check out all you guys' work.
Yeah, just go to YouTube, search Southeastern 16. We do football, baseball, basketball year-round. I literally mean year-round. We've got a weekly show that we've launched in all three sports. So, we're even talking about whatever there is to talk about in baseball, which last week was the draft and signings and portal. And so, like you, we just have an appetite for putting out good coverage in the league and covering whatever there is to cover in those three sports. And it's a lot of fun. It's also a lot of work. But, yeah, I think if people like what they get here, and I think people like our stuff like yours too. So there's probably a crossover there in audiences there. And thank you for having me, Chris.
Chris, you're the man. I appreciate it. We'll definitely do it again soon.
You bet.